going to try and tell you about how the European Commission sees citizen science within the broader sort of practice of societal engagement, and well, hopefully this helps you in applications for our funding, of course, and helps understand the different approach that we take. But maybe I introduce myself first. I'm Lyndon Farrer. I'm a policy officer at DG Research and Innovation in the Open Science Unit, and I'm dealing in particular with science and society issues. So I'll start with the background that I just told you about, and then I'll move on to the opportunities. But it's really a very brief sort of overview of the opportunities, because I think there's quite a few of them coming up, and it probably requires you to do quite a lot of groundwork yourself to work out where you fit in and what's the most interesting. But we'll get to that at the end. First off, why do we promote citizen science and the co-creation of R&I agendas and contents at the European Commission? Well, there's three main reasons. Of course, they interlink. Firstly, we say that it contributes to excellence. It can enlarge the scope of research and innovation, the quality and the quantity of the data collected. It can lead to and enable innovative and creative approaches. It can reduce the time to market of products and services. Secondly, we say that it increases effectiveness because it can leverage vast societal capabilities and collective intelligence that's often excluded from contributing to research and innovation. It really makes no sense to systematically exclude willing actors. So by opening it up, hopefully we really manage to leverage all of this. It can increase the relevance and the responsiveness of research and innovation, and it can trigger behavioural changes in institutions and the general public. So of course, this is you can tie this in with the need to get the maximum out of public funding. Finally, it improves the relationship between science and society. It improves transparency, co-ownership and trust of society in the processes and the outputs of R&I. It can help respond to increased science denial. These kinds of things have really come to the fore. Well, first with the climate crisis, as it started dawning on societies that this is something that we really need to act upon and urgently. And of course, in the last year with the pandemic. So, there's lots of different reasons. I think they interlink, but, I think we can do better research and innovation, get better value for money, and allow ourselves to respond better to all of the different challenges that face us. Now, I realize there's a sort of black box at the top of the screen. I can't get rid of that, so I'll just leave it there. So engagement is an integral part of EU open science policy. What is this? It's not just open access to publications. It's an approach based on open cooperative work and the systematic sharing of knowledge and tools, and as early and as widely as possible in the process. It consists of several different practices, one of which is involving all relevant knowledge actors, such as citizens, civil society and end users, in the co-creation of R&I agendas and contents. So actually, to skip to a Horizon Europe program guide, what kind of activities would fit under societal engagement? How do we split this up? Because of course, engagement could encompass all sorts of different kinds of activities, and in fact, we have a sort of typology split between co-design, co-creation, and co-assessment. Of course, there's different ways of looking at this, but I think I think this is reasonably easy to explain, and it fits rather well with what we try to do in our different actions. So for co-design, we're talking about activities such as workshops, focus groups, or other means to develop R&I agendas, roadmaps and policies. It often includes deep discussion on the implications, the ethics, and the benefits and the challenges related to R&I courses of action or technology development. So this is probably a bit less relevant for some citizen science activities. It's definitely in line with responsible research and innovation that we've promoted, particularly in Horizon 2020, but also in Horizon Europe. But this is one set of practices, we could call it. The second, co-creation, is involving citizens and or end users directly in the development of new knowledge or innovation, for instance, through citizen science and user-led innovation. And then the third one, which is perhaps not concentrated on so much, but hopefully will come to the fore over the coming years, is co-assessment, such as assisting in the monitoring, the evaluation, and the feedback to governance of a project, projects, policies, or programs on an iterative or even a continual basis. So it's a bit like co-design, but going alongside the governance of projects or policies, programs, etc. Anyway, you can find more details in the program guide, and of course this is meant to be a guide for applicants, and also it will be used by the evaluators when looking at proposals. So let's move on to opportunities in Horizon Europe. First off, the structure of the program. You'll be familiar with this by now. I think the main thing to see here is that Pillar 2 brings the industrial parts and the societal challenge parts of Horizon 2020 together. And in the transversal part at the bottom, there's no longer a science within for society part, but you will find attention to the science within for society areas of action, lines of action, in the reforming and enhancing the European R&I system. And that's because the idea is that the bottom-up actions of science within for society are taken up within Pillar 2 and elsewhere, but the strategic elements, the strategic kind of actions to support all of this will be supported from this ERA part. One thing that's not on there are the missions, and these are particularly relevant for engagement and citizen science, I'd say. What are the missions? Well, you can describe them as a portfolio of actions intended to achieve a bold and inspirational as well as a measurable goal. Basically bringing lots of different kinds of actions together to try and achieve something concrete. And there's been 5 proposed missions so far. They haven't been politically agreed to launch, I don't think, yet. Hopefully we'll see that soon. You've got one on cancer, you've got one on climate resilient Europe, you've got one on ocean and waters, one on 100 climate neutral cities, and one on soil and food. And if you look at the Marina Mazzucato reports that have kind of described what missions are about, I think you can find a lot of responsible research and innovation type ideas there in terms of directing research along lines that are important to society. Moreover, if you look at the governing missions report, you'll find an entire section, one of I think just 3 or 4 sections, devoted to the importance of engagement in terms of this co-design, the co-creation and co-assessment. Of course, the co-creation, it may not always be citizen science, it could be multi-stakeholder type approaches, it could be more on the user innovation or frugal innovation side. We don't know, but I think within the missions, at least, there should be lots of opportunities. And I think it's widely agreed that without a significant level of engagement of society and citizens in the missions, they won't be a success. So on this slide, there are some extracts from the Horizon Europe regulation and specific program. I'm not going to read them out. I think basically the message is that if you compare the text in Horizon Europe to what we had before in Horizon 2020, is that there's a lot more attention to co-creation, co-design in Horizon Europe than there was in Horizon 2020. Now, we already did a lot in Horizon 2020, but I think the legal measures in place were more sparse. They weren't quite so intense, let's say, because I think if you look through the regulation of the program, you find repeated mentions of these kinds of issues and how important they will be. Now, if we bear in mind that open science will be the modus operandi of the program, and one of the practices of open science is engagement, you can see that we can expect to see this throughout. And open science will be operationalized throughout the program. It's in the award criteria. It's in the key impact pathways, which really, they're not just a way to monitor pathways to impact, but really shepherd energies through different actions to create impact, and in the topic texts. So if we look at the proposal evaluation, it's a bit blocked on my screen. There's still 3 criteria, but the first one is excellence. And it's the soundness of the proposed methodology, including engagement of citizens, civil society, and end users where appropriate. Now, the methodology is the part where an applicant would have to describe how appropriate open science practices are implemented as an integral part of the proposed methodology. Show how the choice of practices and their implementation are adapted to the nature of the work in a way that increases the chances of the project delivering on its objectives. So it's not a nice to have, it's not expected to be a tick box, it's not a side activity, it's supposed to be an integral part of the proposed methodology that helps to deliver on the objectives. Now, we know that there's lots and lots of cases where engagement is not necessarily justified or needed. There's many different topics covering all sorts of different ways of doing research and innovation, and that's not the point of putting the emphasis on this. But in those cases, the applicant should provide a justification. So I think by having this as part of the evaluation, it's in the proposal form as well, we really get people thinking. And we also, the evaluators have to look at this in particular, whereas in Horizon 2020, that wasn't the case. It depended on the topic text, but here it's very clear what we mean. Learning from Horizon 2020 as well, where public engagement was often conflated really with outreach and dissemination activities, we put a note in and we say that this question does not refer to outreach actions that may be planned as part of communication, dissemination, and exploitation activities. These aspects should be instead described under impact. Now, communication, dissemination, exploitation, absolutely essential, but it's not the same as methodology and this co-creation that we're describing here. So if you are thinking of an activity that covers both, then my suggestion would be to cover the methodological aspects under methodology and those parts that relate to communication, dissemination, or exploitation under impact. I can't see too many grey areas. There may be some, but hopefully things are fairly clear, and I think the evaluators know how to evaluate this. So I think this is an important change we've got from Horizon 2020, and it's perhaps a bit underneath the radar. So some colleagues have analysed the draft work programmes, I should say, not the published ones, but there should be barely any differences between them. Looking at the percentage of topics in Horizon Europe's clusters requesting or suggesting societal engagement. And the grand total is about 27% of the topics in the clusters request or suggest societal engagement. Now, of course, it's very different to suggest than to request, of course, and there can be different kinds of societal engagement mentioned in the topic text. You know, it could be quadruple helix type approaches, it could be responsible research and innovation, it could be ethical deliberation, or it could be explicitly citizen science. But I think this goes to show that there are a lot of opportunities in cluster topics, and engagement is one of the ways that we expect to be able to achieve some impact in this program. You can also see that cluster 6, for instance, more than 60% of the topics request or suggest societal engagement. Some of the other clusters have a bit less, but I think this is a good indication that the emphasis that's put in the regulation and specific program has translated into these concrete topic texts. Now, if you go to the funding and tenders portal and have a search around, you'll find that there's a window, an option to do a quick search on specific priorities, and you can see that in red. And there's an option on societal engagement. At the moment, there's 155 topics listed underneath this. You can see underneath on the bottom left that they, across all sorts of different parts of the program. This 155 doesn't exactly align with with the figures that I showed on the previous slide. I think you need to do a bit of delving yourselves, but I think it's a very easy way to very quickly identify and scan through some of the opportunities there and where we expect societal engagement to have a particularly prominent part to play. Just some examples of opportunities in the clusters. I mean, you can see there are many more than just these, but just to give a sort of breadth out there, there's one from cluster 2 on the impact of online social networks and new media. There's one cluster 5, fostering a just transition in Europe, 10 million there, about 3 projects I'd imagine to be supported. There's a co-funded partnership, driving urban transitions to a sustainable future, 130 million for this, expected or proposed in the work programme. We've got ones in Farm to Fork on identification, assessment, management of emerging food safety issues, 12 million put aside there, potentially 2 projects, one on forestry, one on nature-based solutions. There's a lot out there. I think there's a lot to find in the work programs. Hopefully the search function helps, but probably you've already been looking across the different clusters to see what's there. Just to mention some of the activities under the ERA part, this sort of strategic actions that I mentioned earlier. This year we've got 2 that I'll mention, but there's many more topics in this that are pertinent to citizen science. First one is a capacity building and brokering network to make citizen science an integral part of the European research area. I think the title gives the ambition. The second one is supporting and giving recognition to citizen science in the European research area. And the proposal that will, I guess, be selected once the evaluation is complete, the topic text outlines that there will be two cascading grant mechanisms implemented within this. The first is kickstarting. That's kickstarting and providing support services to at least 100 citizen science activities that are at the conceptual pilot stage. And then the second part is on sustaining, and that's supporting at least 25 ongoing or recent citizen science activities to find ways to sustain their activities. And I think this shows that we do realize that the funding for citizen science is a problem for citizen science initiatives, both for the pilot stage and for sustaining them. There is actually a limit to what we can do, but I think with this action we try to address some of this, and we pilot some of the forms of funding that we think are most likely to help with these issues. And then there's another topic, the final topic that I've got on this slide, which is about developing and piloting training on the practice of open and responsible research and innovation. I think in the topic text, it mentions citizen science. So there's quite a few things going on in this part of the program as well. I think hopefully it should be a support to what happens under the clusters and more widely in the European research area. So I've got to the end. Hopefully it's within the 15 minutes. So citizen and societal engagement can improve the effectiveness, the creativity and the quality of research and innovation. It's an integral part of EU open science policy. Horizon 2020 saw increasing attention to citizen science. In Horizon Europe, you can find opportunities for citizen science across the programme. Importantly, engagement becomes part of the evaluation of proposals. We recognise the challenges for financing citizen science, but with these support measures under ERA, hopefully we can experiment with small-scale funding and do something to support all of this. So that brings me to an end. I hope that was a useful start, and yeah, looking forward to listening to some of the other presenters. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lyndon. There are a couple of questions. There are two from Norbert. Norbert, would you like to voice your questions very, very briefly for Lyndon?
Yeah, some of the aspects were answered in the following, in the later slides. But the question is briefing of evaluators. Of course, if you have a chapter in the form, you have to fill in the proposal. My experience is that evaluators come from very different backgrounds with a very different understanding of let me say co-creation, engagement, and methodologies. And therefore, this, of course, is challenging for all of us who are writing proposals. Is there any idea of briefing evaluators for a better understanding in this context to address the requests from Horizon Europe?
What our recommendation is to colleagues who have a topic that's flagged, so to speak, for engagement, is that they have some expertise related to that. But I think you've well described that it's very context dependent. In different fields of research and innovation, the engagement can take different forms. So we don't go into any specifics there. The Horizon Europe guide functions a bit like the frequently asked questions combined that we had in Horizon 2020. Hopefully this is a good place to start. But really, I think I agree with you. For a topic that heavily suggests engagement of some sort, there should be at least some expertise to try and look at this. But of course, you know, in very thematic areas, you need a mixture of different expertise to really evaluate all those different proposals.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Norbert. Thank you, Lyndon, for the answer. Thierry is asking about the clusters. Where could we find, again, the information on the clusters?
You'll find them on the funding and tenders portal.
Yeah, I guess it might be related to your slide on the percentage of public engagement per cluster, and maybe cluster 6 was the one people were curious about.
That's right. You won't find those figures published. This is a sort of internal analysis that I use for presentations. But I think if you do a scan of the work programs as a whole, because you can download the PDFs, but you know sometimes they're 300 pages long or more. You know, then you can do your own analysis and see how many topics request or suggest different forms of engagement. But I have a feeling that those figures are fairly accurate.
Thank you. And there is a question, a nice question from Carmen. Would you like to introduce it, please?
Yes, sure. Yeah, when I was listening, you were talking about societal engagement, and then you were talking about citizen science, and I wanted to understand better, how is this societal engagement divided? What you consider to be societal engagement? Because one of the aspects you said was citizen science. I wanted to know the rest, and what's the part of citizen science within that larger societal engagement? I know you talked about calls, but maybe in terms of funding as well, that would be interesting to hear.
I'm not really sure how to respond to the funding aspects, because we haven't analysed the different kinds of engagement. I mean, engagement is the umbrella terminology that we use. We know that there's lots of debates about what constitutes citizen science or not. I don't think we want to engage with that, no pun intended, because it's a bit of a minefield. I think we keep things open at a general level, because we know that the different approaches in different areas. And we don't want to straitjacket anyone. That said, applicants can come with a proposal where they very tightly define what it is that they wish to do, and that's up to them. I think that's part of the thinking around developing a good proposal, probably, is working out, what activities it is that you've got in mind. So I'm not really able to say much more than that. I know that in some of the thematic areas, they do provide descriptions. For instance, in some parts of the program, they provide a description of what they mean by, for instance, citizen observations and things like that. But we don't recommend anything at this stage for the whole program. I think if you look at the handbook, that's our general guidance, but you can describe your own approaches as you see fit. I'm not sure I answered your question fully, but maybe I'm not able to. With
no, it's fine. I think you might not be able to, and that's okay. Just wanted to hear if there was more specific answer to that, but that's fine. Thank you.
Are there any more questions for Lyndon?
Norbert has some.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
Norbert, go ahead. We still have a few minutes.
We still have a few minutes. One of the calls you suggested, I think it was on, I don't remember, but they have very large budgets, and only one project will be funded. I remember one of 23 million around that in the in number 9 in biodiversity. I don't know. I see a huge risk in that because when you have these large budgets, of course it needs large consortia with definitely many academics coming in. Isn't there a risk that open science, citizen science, and engagement activities will be pushed to the back because of, let me say, the democratic structure of the proposal writing? And I'm scared a bit, because I see organizations like ours, which are really experienced in the field of engagement, and we might get lost in these big consortia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a valid fear. I think what I've seen in Science Within for Society is that the smaller project sizes can create very good outcomes. One of the things that we recommend experimenting, or at least considering, is cascade funding. We provide a sentence in the handbook again to say that this is a very good way to reach new actors, civil society organizations, citizens, trying to involve them. In terms of open science being pushed to the back, well, the open science is addressed in lots of different ways. So different aspects of open science may be more difficult to avoid than others. There's nothing mandatory around engagement compared to, for instance, data management or publications. So I think there are, you could say there's more risks associated with engagement compared to those areas. But I think the evaluation process is quite is fairly strong, and people will be focused on this. So it does depend. I mean, if you get 3 proposals and the open science practices engagement are not strong in any of them, then probably you're not going to see that in there. But I think when the applicants know that there's a section of the proposal form being looked at, and there could be an evaluator who has a particular eye for this, they're not going to take that risk. I think overall, we're going to see more attention and hopefully better quality engagement than we had in Horizon 2020. But I mean, this isn't going to be the case every single time, I'm certain of it too.
Thanks, Lyndon. We're being optimistic, says Norbert. And maybe one final question from Carmen, who's asking, what amounts are we talking about when we speak about cascading grants per project?
Okay, I'll answer off the top of my head, but I think it used to be called the Annex K of the general of the work program, but you'd have to find out where it is now. It's one of the general annexes. It used to be 60,000 maximum in grants or prizes, but what we've seen in other projects is that smaller amounts of funding are often used, 5, 10, 15, 20, depending on how the proposal is structured and how they would wish to structure their cascade funding. Sometimes it's a sort of stage gate approach where there's an initial support to develop an idea, and then the proposals that have gone through this stage are invited to submit a second proposal for a second tranche of support, which may be more significant to implement the activities. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about these cascade grants. I think it is probably a lot of work, but from what we've seen, it is a good way to reach smaller organizations, newcomers, SMEs, to try and get them involved. And I think for citizen science, that's quite important. One of the things we see with the bigger citizen science, 2, 3, 4 million, is that I think the proportion of the funding that we give that ends up with the citizen science activities is smaller than with, for instance, a cascading grant when that's implemented. So yeah, I'd have a look at the guidance that's again available from the funding and tenders portal for that.
Thanks a lot for all the questions, and thank you, Lyndon, for being with us and shedding some light on Horizon Europe. I think we're going to move on